This is a video about the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, otherwise known as the Nakba, or the Israeli War of Independence, if that's your thing. It has a lot of names. And it's also a video about a YouTuber called Travelingisrael. Who is that? Well, Travelingisrael is a professional tour guide who has been making travel recommendation videos on YouTube for about 7 years. Since October 7th, his channel had a very impressive bump as he started uploading videos mostly focused around countering pro-Palestinian narratives. One of those videos focuses on the Nakba and the Palestinian refugee problem, where in the process of debunking a short video from Vox, he says a lot of things that could use a bit of debunking. So, we're going to talk a good bit about the Nakba, about some of the alternative histories you tend to get from the pro-Israeli side, and why those alternative histories are wrong. And because I expect this video will reach at least a few people who enjoy Travelingisrael's videos, I'm going to counter his claims by only using sources from pro-Zionist writers. So that should be a fun challenge. As we're going to find out in this video, finding out the truth of what happened in the past is hard enough, especially on a topic like this where biases are impossible to avoid. That isn't even to mention what it's like trying to navigate current events as they unfold. That's why I'm personally a big fan of Ground News. The Ground News app and website is a news comparison engine which compiles thousands of articles from different sources, whilst also giving you relevant information about those sources. It'll tell you their political leanings, their levels of factuality, and where they receive funding from. That means that when you're reading about current events in, say, Israel and Palestine, you'll get to see whether or not a particular story is getting disproportionate coverage, and crucially, the differences in how people with different political leanings are choosing to cover it. Take, for example, this recent story about US Navy helicopters destroying Houthi boats in the Red Sea after an attempted hijacking. As you can see, the front page is being regularly updated, and it shows us how little this story has been covered so far by the right wing, making it a potential blind spot. Here you can see bias insights, which shows you the differences between how the story is presented by the left, right, and center. In this case, you can see the left have emphasized the killing of crew members by the US Navy, whereas the center is more focused on the military success of the US, whilst condemning the Houthi attacks as illegal and reckless. So, if that interests you, just go to ground.news/learnerbox or follow the link in the description. There, you can even upgrade to Ground News Vantage and save 40% as part of the holiday season, their biggest discount of the year. Thank you, Ground News, for sponsoring this video. Part 1. Deir Yassin. The first section of his video addresses the massacre at Deir Yassin. Now, honestly, when I first watched this video, I had no idea what a pro-Israel person would have to say about this event. Deir Yassin was a small village just outside of Jerusalem which was attacked by Zionist forces on the 9th of April, just over a month before the surrounding Arab nations entered the war. The attack was spearheaded by two radical right-wing paramilitary forces, the Irgun and Lehi, but it was also approved of and assisted by the Haganah, Israel's leading military force that would eventually be renamed to the IDF. Out of the 700-odd people who lived in the village, just over 100 of them were killed. By all accounts, this was an atrocity. It was immediately condemned by the Haganah, who went on to downplay their role in the event, and it was also condemned by the Jewish Agency for Palestine, who wrote an apology to the King of Jordan. So, on its face, not the easiest thing to make excuses for. Let's see what Travelingisrael had to say about it.
Deir Yassin has probably had more articles and papers written about it than any other event in the war of 1948. The number of dead was around 100. There are not many events with such a low number of casualties that have gotten so much attention.
Now, right off the bat, this is an odd thing to say. Here, he seems annoyed at the number of Google results you get for Deir Yassin, despite the event only resulting in 100 deaths. When I look up the Deir Yassin massacre, I get 131,000 results. Is that really too many? Compared to what? I mean, not that it's a competition, but the 1929 Hebron massacre involved the murder of 67 Jews, and that gets over 200,000 results. The 1972 Munich massacre gets over 1.6 million results, and that only resulted in 17 people dying, 5 of whom were perpetrators. I don't know, that's just a strange thing to bring up, but anyway. We'll move past that and just hear his version of the events.
So what did happen in Deir Yassin? As I said, there was a local peace pact, but the people of Deir Yassin broke that pact when they shot at Jewish vehicles and let Arab fighters into the village. By the start of 1948, it was clear to both sides that the local peace pact was no longer relevant.
So apparently there was a peace pact which was broken by the locals of Deir Yassin when they started shooting at Jewish people and allowing Arab irregular forces to launch attacks from the village. Now, unfortunately, Traveling Israel doesn't source any of his claims, nor does he link any references in the description, and okay, it's a YouTube video, but it does mean I have to look pretty hard to find out where his claims are coming from. In any case, let's just look at what happened to this peace pact. After the UN partition plan, sorry, I know people are going to have a go at me if I don't give the context for this, so here's a quick speed run. In 1947, the population in Palestine was about 1/3 Jewish and 2/3 Arab, and both groups wanted a state. The British, who had been in charge of Palestine for 30 years, gave up on trying to resolve this issue and handed it over to the UN. The UN proposed to cut up the territory into this funny old thing consisting of an Arab state, a Jewish state, and Jerusalem as an international zone. The Zionists said, well, half our state is a desert, and with these borders, the population will still be 45% Arab, but, you know, we're going to bring in a bunch of Jewish immigrants, it'll be fine, and they accepted the plan. The Arabs said, mate, you can't just barge into someone's living room, sit there for 30 years, and then offer to split the house 50-50 and call it a fair deal. The Arabs, who made up 90% of the population in 1917, had no say in there being a Jewish state here, nor did they even have any say in the borders. You see here, there's the Zionist proposal. Where's the Arab proposal? Fun fact, that desert down there was only included into Palestine because of lobbying from Zionist leaders. Throughout the 1920s, King Abdullah made 2 requests to make it part of Jordan, but was ultimately rejected. With that background, the Arabs rejected the plan. 1 day later, 2 buses were attacked by Arab militants and 7 Jews were killed. A civil war broke out across the region, and a broader war between the Zionists and the Arab states was inevitable. And for the first few months of this war, the Zionists were mostly on the defensive. But at the beginning of April, with a good bit of help from illegal arms shipments from Czechoslovakia, they started moving to the offensive. That same month, one of the targets of that offensive was Deir Yassin. So, what were those guys up to? Well, just after the partition plan, several villages tried to stay out of the fighting by making agreements with neighboring communities. On January the 20th, 1948, the notables of Deir Yassin made a peace pact with the leaders of Givat Shol, a Jewish neighborhood in the suburbs of West Jerusalem. They gave mutual assurances for safe travel between the 2 communities, and in Deir Yassin, they agreed to keep Arab irregulars out of the village. In the event that any did show up, they even organized a system of coded signals that could be seen by their Jewish neighbors from a distance. That same month, the people of Deir Yassin fought off a group of irregulars who were trying to use the village as a base to attack Jerusalem. At the end of the month, a group of 400 armed Arabs camped out in the area and tried to recruit villagers from Deir Yassin, but were refused. Then, in the middle of February, an armed group went into Deir Yassin where they were hoping to launch an attack on Givat Shol. When the locals refused to help them, the militants got, big mad and decided to slaughter all the sheep in the village. Whoa. In the middle of March, 3 delegates from the Arab Higher Committee came to the village and asked the locals to host a group of Iraqi and Syrian irregulars. They were refused, and then once again, a similar refusal was made on April 4th. Now, Deir Yassin was attacked at dawn on April 9th, and the decision to target the village was made in the first days of the month. So, where exactly are these repeated violations of the peace pact? Traveling Israel doesn't really say where this happened, nor does he tell you why he believes that, so we just have to guess. He could be referring to the fact that fighting had intensified around the Jerusalem area, or he could be referring to a report at the end of March stating that 150 irregulars had moved into the village, though this did turn out to be false. Was this really the reason they chose to attack the village? Well, it's definitely not the reason they gave at the time. At the time, in the beginning of April, it seemed like the Irgun and Lehi were looking for a target, partly because they just wanted to get involved. That month, the Haganah were carrying out Operation Nashon with the goal of clearing the road to Jerusalem. The Irgun, which consisted largely of untrained teenagers with no military experience, well, outside of committing terror attacks, mainly wanted to improve Jewish morale and to capture supplies for their bases. At least that's how one of their officers put it. The idea that Deir Yassin was posing any kind of threat to the Jews didn't seem to factor in. That's why the Haganah initially advised against attacking the village and even tried to propose alternative targets before reluctantly conceding. And if that's not enough, the Irgun district commander himself had acknowledged that the town was docile, and a Lehi reconnaissance mission before the attack had given the same conclusion. So you might be wondering, why does Traveling Israel have a different opinion from the people who signed off on the attack? Well, I do know the answer because this is a script, but first we're going to let him describe the battle.
At the beginning of the battle, the Jewish forces used loudspeakers to give the women, children, and elderly time to evacuate. Think about it. Basically, the Jews voluntarily gave up the element of surprise, which is crucial in a battle, so that the civilians would have sufficient time to run away.
So the way he just told that story about the loudspeaker is interesting. It is true that Lehi had planned to warn the villagers by loudspeaker before advancing on the village, but the timing here is kind of important, because we now know that the people of Deir Yassin were not alerted to the militia's presence by a loudspeaker. They were alerted by the sound of gunshots. At around 4:45 a.m., the inexperienced Irgun fighters were spotted by a village guard as they were approaching. As the guard started calling out in Arabic, they started firing. Meanwhile, the truck carrying the loudspeaker got stuck in a ditch before it ever reached the outskirts of the village. From here, sure enough, they did broadcast the warning telling villagers to stand down and leave, but to this day, there is no evidence that anyone in the village ever heard it. In other words, the locals of Deir Yassin were not given a warning. They were woken up by gunfire from people they believed they had made peace with. But it's just as well Traveling Israel mentioned this, because thanks to him trying to argue that the Jewish forces had given a warning, thus giving up the element of surprise, I was able to find out where he's getting his stories from. As I was reading about Deir Yassin, I came across this paper about the evolution of historical debates about the massacre. It mentions that in 1969, the Israeli Foreign Ministry published a 9-page pamphlet entitled Background Notes on Current Themes, Deir Yassin. It talks about how there was a Palestinian and Iraqi garrison in the village and that they supposedly ambushed Irgun troops after pretending to surrender with white flags. It mentions a group of Iraqi irregulars who tried to escape in women's dress. Of course, there is no evidence for any of this, but lo and behold, the pamphlet also stated that the Jewish units attacked the village only after a truck with a megaphone warned non-combatants to withdraw from the danger zone, thus sacrificing the element of surprise. And when I first read that, I was like, shit, that's what the Traveling Israel guy said.
Think about it. Basically, the Jews voluntarily gave up the element of surprise, which is crucial in a battle.
Now, when this 1969 pamphlet was released, it did inspire a few articles in right-wing Zionist outlets. One writer used it as a springboard to describe Deir Yassin as a 21-year-old blood libel. Love that. Of course, this version of the story is dated, to put it lightly. Most of it can be completely disproven by Israel's own documents, but where did this story come from? Apparently, the 1969 pamphlet was initiated by Menachem Begin, who was then a minister of the Israeli cabinet. Who the f*** was he? Well, he was none other than the Irgun leader at the time of Deir Yassin. Though he wasn't present at this operation, he already had a bit of a reputation, most notably for launching terror attacks at the British and the Arabs. In the 1950s, he was banned from entering the UK due to his role as a leader of a notorious terrorist organization. He would eventually go on to found the Likud party and was elected Prime Minister in 1977. And after an ungodly amount of digging, I managed to find this book called The Revolt, a memoir published by Begin in 1950, where he gives this very familiar statement.
At the beginning of the battle, the Jewish forces used loudspeakers to give the women, children, and elderly time to evacuate. Think about it. Basically, the Jews voluntarily gave up the element of surprise.
As far as I've been able to find, this is the oldest source for Traveling Israel's claim. Now, I am no historian. I'm a YouTuber. But I do feel quite confident in saying that if you want to learn the facts about a massacre, the last place you should go to is a 73-year-old memoir from the leader of the guys who did the massacre. That's probably not a good idea. Begin would go on to reiterate this version of events for decades. Like Traveling Israel, he also pushed the idea that Deir Yassin was far from a peaceful village. In an article from 1971, he described it as a fortified hotbed of rioters and lawbreakers. But interestingly, his book from 1950 never mentions anything about attacks launched from Deir Yassin, nor does it say anything about Arab forces in the village. That part just seems to be an embellishment that he added on to the story a few years later. But to be fair, Traveling Israel doesn't completely parrot Begin's version of the story. He does admit that people were shot by the Jewish forces even after they surrendered, but the way he characterizes their deaths is a little problematic.
In the aftermath of that battle, there were 5 Jewish dead and about 100 Arabs dead. Of those Arabs who died, many were fighters, but some were civilians who had hidden in their houses, and there were about 10 to 20 civilians who had been shot by Lehi and Etzel members after they had surrendered. The Deir Yassin battle was small, poorly planned, and poorly executed. A few dozen civilians died during the fighting, and at most, if you take the highest estimation, 40 civilians were shot after they had surrendered.
So, as for this collection of numbers, I have no idea where he got those from. It is true that the attackers encountered more resistance than they expected. The locals of Deir Yassin were well aware of the tensions escalating around them, and the village was reasonably well defended. As they struggled to fight through the village, the Irgun troops got frustrated and resorted to throwing grenades into houses with whole families inside them. Traveling Israel doesn't mention this, but they also fired at people as they were trying to escape or surrender. But anyway, when he talks about the number of people who died, what exactly is he trying to say when he separates fighters from civilians? Well, if you believed what he said about Deir Yassin villagers frequently violating the peace pact, you'd think, those are the fighters. But now that we know this wasn't the case, the people he's referring to as fighters are simply people trying to defend their village from an outside attack. Without warning. The Irgun and Lehi fighters may not have gone into Deir Yassin with a concrete plan to massacre the locals, but they were intending to expel them. And, at least in my opinion, if a civilian tries to defend themselves from an unprovoked attack, even if it's with lethal force, they are still a civilian. The people in Deir Yassin were no less civilians than the Israelis who fought to defend their communities on October 7th. And since he doesn't go into much detail about what happened afterwards, well, first of all, the Irgun and Lehi troops started looting the houses as well as the corpses. After collecting money and jewelry from the survivors, they were loaded onto trucks and paraded through the streets of West Jerusalem, where locals spat on and even threw stones at them. The women and children were offloaded near the old city walls, where they were left to walk into East Jerusalem and fend for themselves. Some of the prisoners were killed there and then. The others, mostly men, as well as at least 7 women and elderly people, were taken back to Deir Yassin and murdered in the quarry. And a report from Haganah intelligence mentioned another group of women prisoners who were taken to the occupied village of Sheikh Badir and shot dead. So, at the beginning of this video, you might remember Traveling Israel being very incredulous about why Deir Yassin is always the first massacre that comes to mind when people talk about 1948. Well, for one, Deir Yassin is far from the only massacre carried out against Arabs during the war. Even conservative estimates list well over 20. There was Salih, where the occupying Israeli troops blew up a mosque, killing between 60 and 80 people who were taking shelter inside. Safsaf, where 52 people were tied up and shot. Dawayima, which was famously downplayed by both the Jews and the Arabs who didn't want to further demoralize their population. This was also where an Israeli report mentioned a woman who had been kept alive and employed to clean the courtyard where the occupied soldiers were eating. She was allowed to do this job for about 2 days before being shot along with her baby. So, There are plenty of examples, but in any case, there is a very well-known reason that Deir Yassin is the first one people go to. It's because this is the one that played a pivotal role in spreading terror amongst Arab villagers, driving them to flee from their homes. It took place fairly early in the conflict, just over a month before any of the regular Arab armies had even set foot in Palestine, and the news of the massacre had spread like wildfire through the neighboring communities and even as far as towns like Tiberias and Jaffa. Subsequent massacres were often referred to as repeats of Deir Yassin. Before long, most of the Palestinian upper classes had fled, leaving the locals leaderless and demoralized. As the Israeli forces were fighting for control over cities like Jaffa and Haifa, Deir Yassin was fresh in the locals' minds, and naturally, many of them felt like fleeing was just a better option than taking their chances with Jewish forces. But I know Travelingisrael knows this because he alludes to it later in the video. Only his interpretation is a bit different.
Zionist militias used it as a propaganda tool to tell people about it everywhere. The idea was that if you don't leave, we will do to you what happened in Deir Yassin.
No, not true. The Jewish military or political leaders never used the Deir Yassin battle to urge the Palestinians to leave their homes. It was the Arabs who used the story of Deir Yassin to motivate other Arabs to fight.
So, two things. One, if someone commits a massacre against a peaceful village and the news of that attack causes people to flee, who is more to blame? The people who did the massacre or the people who spoke about it afterwards? Do I even need to answer that? And two, he is right that the massacre was initially exaggerated by Arab leaders in the hope of galvanizing the population, and that those efforts backfired. What he leaves out is that everyone exaggerated what happened in Deir Yassin. When he says the Zionists never used Deir Yassin to inspire Arab flight, this is just wrong. Obviously, Arab news reports will have had more of an influence because that's what the Arabs would have been listening to, but the Jewish forces did play their part. In fact, it's quite possible that the first people to exaggerate the events of Deir Yassin were the Irgun themselves. On the night of the massacre, an Irgun commander put out a press release stating that 254 people had died. As he would later say, "I told the reporters that 254 were killed so that a big figure would be published and so that Arabs would panic across the country." This number was then picked up and repeated by the British, Arab, and Jewish media alike. On April 14th, an Irgun radio broadcast bragged about how quickly the surrounding villages were emptied after Deir Yassin, saying that in one blow, we changed the strategic situation of our capital. And none other than Menachem Begin would later say that the legend, he denied that the massacre was real, was worth half a dozen battalions to the forces of Israel. Panic overwhelmed the Arabs of Eretz Israel, helped us in particular in Tiberias and the conquest of Haifa. That reference to Haifa will be important in a minute, so take note. Now, would more people have stayed if they'd known that only half the number of people had died? Who knows? What we do know is the first exaggerated number most likely came from the people who did the killing. That 254 number was the default figure given by Israelis for decades. And it was only in 1987 when two Palestinian authors set about identifying the victims of Deir Yassin by name, where they landed on the 107 number that is mostly used today. Isn't that interesting? Part 2. Haifa. In the Vox video, they mention the major towns that were depopulated during the war, and one of the examples they give is Haifa. By mentioning this city in particular, Travelingisrael seems to think he's caught them falling into a trap.
After taking Deir Yassin, Zionist paramilitary groups cleared major cities, including Haifa and Jaffa.
Now, Vox made a big mistake here when they used Haifa as an example. Here they dug a deep hole for themselves, and I'm going to let them fall right into it. The Battle of Haifa is the best example of what really happened to the Arabs in the war and how they came to be refugees. So Haifa was a mixed city, half Jews and half Arabs. The Arabs started shooting at Jewish cars entering Haifa, which led to fighting between the Jewish neighborhoods and the Arabs. Now, Haifa was one of the biggest centers of Arab leaderships. And what did the Arab leadership do? It ran away. Arab gangs started to fight among themselves and rob the local Arabs. The Jewish mayor of Haifa, Moshe Carmel, told the Arabs they could stay and that they would not be hurt. The Arab asked the Mufti, Amin al-Husseini, the head of the Arab High Committee, what to do. And he said, don't surrender to the Jews and don't cooperate with them. Run away, and in a few weeks, the Arab armies will conquer Haifa and you will be able to go back.
So, how true is any of this? Well, point one is true enough. Following the partition plan, months of urban conflict in Haifa had resulted in a food shortage, and the imminent departure of the British caused a surge in unemployment. Before the battle had even started, roughly 20 to 30,000 Arabs had already left the city. Two is mostly correct, although he does name the wrong person when he brings up the Jewish mayor. The mayor's name was actually Shabtai Levi, and yes, he did ask the Arabs to stay after the battle was over. But Moshe Carmel, the guy named and pictured in Traveling Israel's video, was definitely not the mayor of Haifa. He was the Haganah commander who led the attack on the city. And more crucially, he was the one who was put in charge of Haifa after the battle was over. So that's a little embarrassing, but I guess if we change this around, the rest of this is basically true. As for number three, well, no. The initial call for the Arabs to leave doesn't seem to have come from Husseini or from anyone outside of the city. Actually, one of the reasons so many people left Haifa before the battle was exactly because they had become demoralized by the lack of leadership from the Arab world. In the early months of 1948, they had repeatedly called for help from Damascus and the Arab Higher Committee, but had been ignored. The Arab Higher Committee would eventually join the call for Arabs to leave Haifa, but this wouldn't happen until April 25th, when the mass departure was already underway. It might have been the case that they chose to leave because they were expecting a quick Arab victory, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence for that. So I guess after I polish up some of Traveling Israel's arguments for him, this is what we have. And this, I think, would be a very good example of a collection of statements that are all factually true, but nonetheless misleading. Haifa was a city where an almost equal number of Jews and Arabs had coexisted for decades. After the battle, the Arabs of Haifa had their own leaders telling them to leave, and the Jewish leaders imploring them to stay. Why then did almost all of them only listen to the former? Well, maybe we could look more closely at what happened. In the early morning of April 21st, the British announced a sudden redeployment of troops out of their downtown positions in Haifa. The result was an immediate clash between Jews and Arabs, both fighting for control over the abandoned British buildings in the city. The Carmeli Brigade, led by Moshe Carmel, held an impromptu meeting, and by the early afternoon, they had drawn up a plan called Operation Passover Cleansing. Guess they didn't have the PR campaign present when they came up with that one. The aim of the operation was to break the enemy by simultaneously attacking from several directions with a barrage of heavy mortars and psychological warfare. And for those of you who don't know, here is an example of the kind of mortars that were used in this war. This one, known as the Davidka, was known for its wildly inaccurate aim and notably loud explosions designed to scare the enemy. As for psychological warfare, this involved a loudspeaker truck rolling through the city, broadcasting to the locals that the day of judgment has arrived. For the Haganah, demoralization was a primary aim. It was deemed just as important to the outcome as the physical destruction of the Arab units. And naturally, one of the side effects of spreading fear amongst enemy soldiers is that you also inevitably spread fear amongst the civilians. The massacre at Deir Yassin that took place less than 3 weeks earlier was still fresh on people's minds, and before the battle was over, the only message they were getting from the Haganah was to leave. By 1 p.m. the next day, over 6,000 people had fled to the harbor, trampling over each other as they rushed onto the boats, many of which ended up capsizing. In the words of a British intelligence officer watching the harbor entrance, during the morning, the Jews were continually shooting down all Arabs who moved. This included completely indiscriminate and revolting machine gun fire, mortar fire, and sniping on women and children sheltering in churches and attempting to get out. There was considerable congestion outside the east gate of hysterical and terrified Arab women and children and old people on whom the Jews opened up mercilessly with fire. All in all, the battle lasted around 24 hours, and in that time, 15,000 Arabs had already fled the city before anyone had told them to do anything. So now, with about half of the Arab population gone, here we are at the part Travelingisrael mentions. This was when the local Arab leaders met with British and Jewish officials and announced that they wanted the remaining Arabs to be evacuated. And it is true that the other officials were shocked by this decision. The Jewish mayor did sincerely make an effort to convince the Arabs to stay, as did some of the other local leaders. The problem was they weren't the only ones making decisions. After the battle, the Haganah's next step was to root out any remaining fighters and disarm the Arab population. In order to do this, the city was placed under military rule and the civilian leadership, including the mayor, was sidelined. The commander, Moshe Carmel, who Travelingisrael mistook for the local mayor, was put in charge, and the message he gave to Palestinians was quite different. The Haganah were expecting a quick response from Arab forces, and in order to prepare, they carried out a rushed security operation involving curfews, searches, interrogations, and imprisonment. Putting speed above everything else, these procedures were very arbitrary and often resulted in beatings and other inhumane treatment. Their orders to the troops did involve some red lines, such as forbidding them from entering mosques or from looting abandoned property, but it made no mention of persuading the locals to stay. So stopping further evacuations was the last thing on their minds. They might have even wanted the complete opposite. After all, the commander's first priority was to secure the city, and they knew all too well that an Arab exodus would only make this job easier. As people started to leave, they were quickly relieved of the idea of having to defend the city, whilst also having to watch over an Arab population that they considered hostile. A Haifa without Arabs was simply easier to control. It also definitely didn't help that one day after the battle, the Irgun moved into downtown Haifa, and their policy was a bit more blunt. What they wanted was to promote a further rush of armed forces into the souk and other places where Arabs were still living, to force the issue by creating more refugees and a new wave of terror. The Irgun and the Haganah had both taken part in the Deir Yassin massacre, and to the Arabs, the actions of these troops spoke far louder than anyone who was still asking them to stay. The civilian Jewish leaders were completely disempowered. Several of them spent the week traveling through Arab neighborhoods and urging people to stay, but against the actions of the soldiers, their pleas were meaningless. And as it turns out, a few of them even changed their minds as they quickly became seduced by the idea of turning Haifa into a permanent Jewish city. As one observer noted, a different wind began to blow. It was good without Arabs. It was easier. Everything changed within a week. What the story of Haifa does seem to show is that even where Palestinians weren't being directly expelled as a matter of policy, and even where some of the Jewish authorities were asking them to stay, Arab flight was still a preferred outcome for a lot of the people in charge. Which brings us to this comment.
The Battle of Haifa is the best example of what really happened to the Arabs in the war and how they came to be refugees.
Now, I have to wonder, why does Travelingisrael think this is the best example of what happened in 1948? Does he think this was the norm? Was it often the case that Palestinians were asked to stay by the Jews and only left because their own leaders told them to? Well, thankfully, we have an entire list of all the communities that were depopulated during the war and their decisive cause of abandonment. So here we have A for abandonment on Arab orders. You can go down to Haifa, where there's an A and also an M for military assault on settlements, so that all makes sense. We have a good number of E's there, which means the people were directly expelled by Jewish forces, but don't worry about those ones. So if Haifa really is the best example, how many A's do we have here? Well, out of 377 towns and villages, we have 6. 6 cases where Arab orders were the decisive cause of people leaving. And just for the sake of perspective, that's almost the same number of massacres that the IDF managed to commit in Operation Hiram in just under 3 days. We know for a fact that they committed 5, and they might very well have committed a 6th, although the relevant archives in that one case have never been opened. And also, the leader of that operation just happened to be Moshe Carmel. Yeah. Unfortunately, Traveling Israel's opinion on this is far from unusual. The idea that the Nakba was mostly made up of Arabs leaving because someone else told them to was the mainstream Israeli opinion for decades. Today, that myth can be effectively dismantled just by using Israel's own documents, but a large portion of Israeli society, especially the right wing, is still a very long way from catching up. When Traveling Israel describes Haifa as the best example of what happened in 1948, it's clear that he is still very much part of that old guard. And that also leads him to end up saying things like this.
Folks want to show you that the Jews planned the transfer of the Arabs. The thing is that in all Zionist documents, from the first Zionist Congress to the Israeli Declaration of Independence, there is absolutely nothing to support this theory. They actually state the opposite, that all people will enjoy equal rights. The Zionist movement never said anything about removing non-Jews from the land. On the contrary, the Zionist movement said very clearly that all people from all religions could be granted their human rights.
This, I think, is Traveling Israel at his worst. He is either lying or just horribly ignorant. We have countless examples of people in the Zionist movement speaking favorably about the notion of removing non-Jews. Some of them even saw what they called transfer as something that was necessary for establishing the Jewish state. By the way, for the purpose of this section, the word transfer is just a euphemism for expulsion. In this context, they mean exactly the same thing. For one example, even Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement, may have publicly had a very utopian vision of cooperation between Jews and Arabs, but privately his feelings were a little different. In 1895, he wrote in his diary about a much more sobering expectation of what would happen, arguing, "We must expropriate gently. We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries while denying it any employment in our country. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly." Right at the turn of the century, he was warned by a Jerusalem dignitary that Zionism could only succeed against the will of the Arab majority, that dispossession and war would be the inevitable outcome. Herzl, who seemed to hold similar feelings in private, simply dismissed the warnings. As for Zionist leadership leading up to 1948, well, when Traveling Israel says, from the first Zionist Congress to the Declaration of Independence, he's really just digging his own hole there. At the 20th Zionist Congress in 1937, a certain leader argued, "In many parts of the country, new Jewish settlement will not be possible unless there is a transfer of the Arab peasantry. The transfer of the population is what makes possible a comprehensive settlement plan. Jewish power in the country, which is continuously growing, will also increase our possibilities to carry out the transfer on a large scale. You must remember that this method contains an important humane and Zionist idea. To shift parts of a people, i.e. Palestine Arabs, to their own country and to settle empty lands." The leader who said that was David Ben-Gurion, who would go on to become Israel's first prime minister in 1948. It's actually kind of ironic that Traveling Israel came out with such a strong statement as the Zionist movement never said anything about removing non-Jews from the land. Not only is it completely false, but you could actually make an equally strong statement in the other direction. I could say that throughout the 30s and 40s, Ben-Gurion never went on record against the idea of transfer. Actually, he spoke in support of it quite often. In 1938, he told the Jewish Agency executive that he supported compulsory transfer and that he didn't see in it anything immoral. In 1944, he argued that the transfer of Arabs is easier than any other transfer. There are Arab states around Palestine, and it is clear that if the Arabs are dispatched out of Palestine, this will ameliorate their situation, not the contrary. As for other leaders, Chaim Weizmann, the liberal leader who would later become Israel's first president, spoke about the notion of transferring 500,000 Arabs and 2 million Jews being put in their place. In his words, that would be a first installment. And he even suggested where the first removals would take place. And it also seems to be the case that supportive statements like this can be found from the majority of Zionist leaders in the decades leading up to the war. So I don't know why Traveling Israel believes no one ever said these kinds of things. He hasn't said why, but anyway. Part 4. Plan Dalet. Coming up to the war, Traveling Israel argues that the Declaration of Independence offered equal rights and citizenship to all Arabs in the new Jewish state. And he's right. It did say that. But, as with Haifa, the words of political leaders don't always match up with the actions on the ground. If we go back to our list of towns and villages, just over 50 of them, around 15%, were depopulated as a result of expulsion by Jewish forces. As in, the people were told to leave, often the troops would fire shots over their heads to give them a push, and the houses were dynamited. The largest of these expulsions, in the towns of Lydda and Ramla, was directly approved by Ben-Gurion himself. And how he went about this will be useful for this last part. Lydda and Ramla were in the Arab side of the partition plan, but they were considered a strategic danger because of their placement on the road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Ben-Gurion described them as two thorns in the Yeshuv's side and had written several times in his diary that they had to be destroyed. When the towns were occupied, a group of leaders met and it was suggested that the locals be expelled. Initially, Ben-Gurion didn't say anything and no decision was taken. Instead, he stepped outside for a cigarette where he was asked what should be done with the Arabs. Now, supposedly off the record, Ben-Gurion gave a dismissive wave and said, "Expel them." Within a few minutes, the order was given and signed by Yitzhak Rabin, and between 50 to 70,000 people were brutally expelled and sent towards the Arab front lines. Many of them had to move on foot in the middle of a summer heat wave, and a good number of them died on the way. A few decades later, Rabin would become Israel's prime minister and a key figure in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. The fact that Ben-Gurion seemingly didn't want to commit to ordering an expulsion on paper is quite interesting, and someone like Traveling Israel would do well to learn from it. In his section on Plan D, he argues against the idea that Plan Dalet was a blueprint for ethnic cleansing. Instead, he argues that it was a response to Arab aggression which aimed at securing Jewish settlements and the strategic routes between those settlements. The expulsions, he argues, were only conditional in cases of resistance, whilst villages that cooperated were allowed to go on with their lives. And that last part is a bit sanitized. The plan actually says that cooperative villages would be placed under military control, but okay. He is right about the expulsions being conditional, but that's not really the point. What I think the Nakba shows is that you don't necessarily need a piece of paper saying execute Order 66 to kick out all the Arabs in order to achieve that result. Even if you believe that Plan Dalet wasn't, quote, an expulsion policy, that doesn't mean expulsion still wasn't a desired outcome. And often when people latch on to the idea that there was no expulsion policy, they don't really seem to understand the full context of that argument. That when someone does make that point, they might make it like this. Ben-Gurion clearly wanted as few Arabs as possible in the Jewish state. From early on, he hoped that they would flee. He hinted at this in February 1948, and he said so explicitly in meetings in August, September, and October. But no expulsion policy was ever enunciated, and Ben-Gurion always refrained from issuing clear or written expulsion orders. He preferred that his generals understand what he wanted. He probably wished to avoid going down in history as the great expeller, and he did not want his government to be blamed for a morally questionable policy. And personally, I don't think this sounds like someone who isn't supporting the idea of expulsion. This looks like someone who is endorsing expulsion, encouraging it, whilst repeatedly washing his hands of it. As for the Palestinians, sure. Most of them were not directly ordered to leave their homes at the point of a gun. Does that mean they weren't still forced out? If news of massacres and indiscriminate assaults are sweeping across the area, and someone leaves their village knowing that the groups who carried out those atrocities are approaching, is that person really leaving of their own accord? Well, no. Obviously not. That's insane. People can debate the nuances of whether or not Plan Dalet was an expulsion policy. That's fine. But if people like Travelingisrael want to claim that expulsion wasn't at least one of Israel's goals, how does he explain what happened after the war? Because after the war, the majority of the depopulated villages were destroyed, and most of this destruction took place directly at the hands of the Zionist forces after the fighting had ended. Some of the sites, including Deir Yassin, had new settlements built directly over them. Others became parks, recreational spaces, or military sites. Others were left in ruins. The result, as it was well understood by the leaders, was that it killed off any prospect of the Arab refugees ever returning. For the few who did make it back across the border, they found that there was nothing to return to. Most of them were stopped at the border and turned away. Other times, they were shot at. And these measures were taken directly in line with IDF policy of preventing a refugee return. So, how do we wrap this up? Be careful when YouTubers just kind of say things without showing you any proof. If you plan on becoming a YouTuber who says things, make sure you source your claims, or at least say things that are easy enough to check on Google. And if you're wondering where to source your claims from, say about a historical massacre, maybe don't get your opinions from the literal terrorist leader of the group that did the massacre. I mean, that's just dumb. Special thanks to Al and Garner Haney for your outrageous generosity. Okay, bye.
All people have the right to self-determination, but you don't have the right to reinvent history.